There is a particular quality of light in the last hour before sunset that photographers call the golden hour. The light is warmer than it will be tomorrow. More forgiving. It makes ordinary things look extraordinary, and extraordinary things look eternal. People who understand light know that this quality is not evidence of anything permanent. It is evidence of precisely the opposite. It is the specific quality that light acquires at the boundary between day and night, the beauty that belongs to the ending, the particular radiance that is produced not by the stability of the light but by its imminent transformation into something fundamentally different. There is a specific quality of the present moment of human civilization that Yuval Noah Harari identifies with something like this. Not the beauty exactly, but the specific character of a world that is approaching its own version of the golden hour, the moment just before the fundamental transformation, the moment in which the world that has existed in its essential character and its essential structure across the entirety of what we call recorded human civilization is still present, still recognizable, still the world that human beings have built all of their frameworks and all of their institutions and all of their deepest assumptions about what a human life is and what a human society is for around, but present in the way of something that is approaching the boundary of its own continuation. Present in the way of something that is living, in the most literal sense of that phrase, on borrowed time. Harari does not say this casually. He says it with the specific, earned seriousness of a historian who has spent his professional life examining how civilizations change, how the things that seemed most permanent turned out to be most contingent, how the structures that appeared most stable turned out to be most fragile, how the worlds that people could not imagine being otherwise turned out to be otherwise, not at the end of geological timescales, but at the end of human ones. Within the span of individual lives, within the lifetimes of people who began their existence in one kind of world and ended it in another kind of world that the beginning of their existence could not have imagined and could not have prepared for in any adequate way. He says it with the specific seriousness of someone who has identified, in the convergence of the specific developments of the present moment, something that goes beyond the ordinary pace of historical change that has always made each generation's world somewhat different from the previous generation's world. Something that constitutes not a change in degree but a change in kind. Not the next iteration of the world that human civilization has been continuously producing across the span of its entire history. The ending of that iteration. The boundary across which the world on the other side will be different, not in the way that the 15th century world was different from the 14th century world, but in the way that the world of conscious beings was different from the world before conscious beings existed. The year that Harari points to is not a single year with a fixed calendar date. It is more accurately described as a window. A span of years close enough in the historical perspective to constitute a single moment even if it spans a decade or two in calendar time, within which the convergence of the specific developments he has been tracking across the entirety of his career will reach the threshold that constitutes the genuine transformation. The threshold at which the accumulation of the incremental changes that have been occurring across the last several decades reaches the specific critical mass at which the character of the world changes qualitatively rather than continuing to change quantitatively. He has been pointing toward the 2030s as the decade in which this convergence is most likely to reach its threshold. Not as a prediction in the sense of a confident forecast, as an assessment in the sense of the honest evaluation of a historian who has looked carefully at the rates of change of the specific developments he regards as most consequential and has traced the trajectories that those rates of change describe toward the years in which those trajectories are most likely to intersect in the ways that would constitute the genuine transformation. But the specific year matters less than the specific character of what is coming. And what is coming in Harari's account is something that requires the most serious and the most honest possible engagement from every human being who is alive in the window that remains before its arrival. To understand what Harari means requires understanding something about the specific character of the developments that he regards as most consequential. Not the developments in isolation, each of which can be understood as important in its specific domain without necessarily being understood as part of a convergence that constitutes a civilizational transformation. But the developments in their convergence, in the specific ways that each of them interacts with the others to produce emergent effects that none of them would produce alone. The first development is the one that Harari has addressed most extensively across his recent work. The development of artificial intelligence that is not a tool in the sense that every previous technology has been a tool. Every previous technology was an amplification of a specific human capability applied to a specific domain. The wheel amplified the capacity for physical transport. The printing press amplified the capacity for information distribution. The computer amplified the capacity for data processing. Each of these was powerful in its domain while leaving the broader landscape of human cognitive capability intact as the domain within which human beings maintained the decisive advantage. Artificial intelligence is not amplifying a specific human capability. It is developing a general cognitive capability, not limited to a specific domain, not requiring the specific kind of human input, the human definition of the problem and the human design of the solution architecture that every previous form of computational technology required. Learning from experience, improving through iteration, developing across an expanding range of domains the specific kinds of judgment, creativity, and contextual understanding that were previously the exclusive province of human cognitive capability. The rate of this development is the thing that Harari regards as most important and most consistently underestimated in the mainstream assessments of what artificial intelligence means for the human future. The rate is not linear. It is not the rate of a technology that improves by a fixed increment in each successive period of development. It is the rate of a technology that improves by an accelerating increment, that gets better at getting better, that uses each improvement in capability to accelerate the development of the next improvement. That is, in other words, on a trajectory that, traced forward across the span of years that separate the present from the 2030s, points toward a level of capability that the most sophisticated current systems have not yet approached, and that the human capacity for imagining what sophisticated AI looks like is not yet adequate to accurately represent. The specific threshold that the trajectory points toward, the threshold that constitutes the transformation rather than merely the continuation of the incremental development that has been occurring, is the threshold at which artificial intelligence systems become capable of performing across a sufficiently broad range of domains at a level that exceeds human capability in ways that cannot be supplemented by human oversight and human correction. The threshold at which the relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence shifts from the relationship of the person and the tool to the relationship of two different kinds of intelligence whose relative capabilities are no longer organized in the way that has characterized the relationship between human beings and every system they have built across the entirety of their history. This threshold is not a specific benchmark. It is a process, a gradual, domain-by-domain, capability-by-capability crossing of the line at which the artificial system is better than the human system at the specific thing the human system was doing. A crossing that has already occurred in specific domains, chess and certain medical diagnoses and certain forms of pattern recognition, and that is extending with each passing year across additional domains in ways that the trajectory of development makes it increasingly difficult to identify as a bounded process with a natural limit. The second development in the convergence is biotechnology, the expanding capacity to understand and manipulate the biological processes that determine what kind of organism a human being is. The specific consequential threshold that Harari identifies in this domain is not the capacity to cure diseases, though that capacity is genuine and genuinely valuable. It is the capacity to alter the fundamental parameters of what a human being is, the cognitive parameters, the emotional parameters, the physical parameters, the lifespan, the capacity for suffering and for joy, the specific configuration of the biological substrate that generates the conscious experience of being a human being. For the entirety of human history, these parameters were given. They were the product of evolutionary processes operating across timescales that made individual or civilizational intervention in them impossible. The human being that existed in 10,000 BCE and the human being that exists today are, in the most fundamental biological dimensions, the same kind of thing. The same basic cognitive architecture, the same basic emotional operating system, the same basic relationship to mortality and to the biological cycles of growth and decay that have characterized human existence across the entire span of the species' history. The biotechnological developments of the present moment are creating, for the first time, the technical capacity to alter these parameters deliberately and within timescales that are human rather than evolutionary. CRISPR gene editing is the most visible current expression of this capacity, but it is the beginning of a development trajectory that, followed across the span of years that separate the present from the 2030s, points toward capacities for biological self-modification that go far beyond the elimination of specific disease-causing mutations and into the domain of the deliberate redesign of the fundamental parameters of what human beings are. The convergence of artificial intelligence and biotechnology is what makes both of them, in combination, something qualitatively different from what either of them represents in isolation. The artificial intelligence systems are developing the capacity to understand biological systems, including the human biological system, at levels of depth and comprehensiveness that human biological researchers cannot match. They are developing the capacity to identify the specific genetic configurations that correspond to specific biological outcomes, including cognitive and emotional outcomes, with a precision that makes the deliberate modification of those configurations not merely theoretically possible, but practically achievable within the timescales of the next decade or two. They are developing the capacity to design biological interventions, new pharmaceutical compounds, new gene therapy approaches, new neurotechnological interfaces that no human researcher or team of human researchers working without AI assistance would be able to develop with the same speed or the same sophistication. The convergence creates a feedback loop in which each development accelerates the other. The more capable the artificial intelligence systems become, the more rapidly the biotechnological interventions they help design can advance. The more advanced the biotechnological understanding of the human cognitive and emotional system, the more capable the artificial intelligence systems that are built with that understanding can be made to become. The two trajectories are not parallel, they are braided, each amplifying the other's development in ways that make the combined rate of advance considerably faster than either trajectory alone would produce. The third development in the convergence is the one that Harari regards as least visible and most consequential in its implications for the specific character of the transformation that is coming. It is the development of the capacity to understand and to predict and ultimately to influence the internal states of human beings through the analysis of the data that those human beings continuously generate about themselves through their interaction with the digital systems that mediate an increasingly large proportion of their daily experience. This development has been occurring gradually and largely invisibly across the last 2 decades, as the digital platforms have been accumulating the behavioral data that the billions of people using those platforms generate through every click and every pause and every search and every purchase and every social interaction that the platforms mediate. The quantity of this data and the sophistication of the analytical systems that process it have reached the point at which those systems can model the internal states, the preferences, the fears, the vulnerabilities, the decision-making patterns of individual human beings with an accuracy that, in many specific domains, exceeds the accuracy of the individual's own self-assessment. The threshold that this development is approaching and that Harari identifies as one of the most consequential components of the transformation is the threshold at which this capacity extends from the modeling of preferences and decision patterns to the modeling and the influencing of the deeper dimensions of human consciousness, the values that organize behavior, the beliefs that constitute the framework within which experience is interpreted, the emotional dispositions that determine how events are processed and responded to, the specific quality of the inner life that has always been in every framework for understanding what human beings are, the dimension of the human being that is most essentially their own, most private, most beyond the reach of external observation and external influence. The convergence of these three developments in the specific window of years that Harari is pointing toward is not the continuation of the trajectory of change that human civilization has been on. It is the approach to the boundary across which that trajectory cannot continue in its current form because the fundamental conditions that have defined the trajectory, the conditions of a world in which human beings are the most capable cognitive entities, in which the basic biological parameters of human existence are fixed, and in which the inner life of the individual human being is substantially beyond the reach of external observation and influence, will have been transformed in ways that make the trajectory's continuation impossible. What comes after the boundary is genuinely unknown. This is one of the things that Harari says with the most consistency and the most honesty. The genuine uncertainty of the post-boundary world is not a failure of analytical precision or a gap in the historical knowledge that a more thorough analysis would fill. It is a structural feature of the specific character of the transformation. The previous civilizational transformations that Harari's historical work has examined were transformations of the surface features of the human world within the constant deep structure of the human condition. The world after the agricultural revolution was different from the world before it. But the human beings who inhabited both worlds were the same kind of being, with the same fundamental cognitive and emotional architecture and the same fundamental existential situation. The transformation was to the world, not to the nature of the beings who inhabited it. The transformation that is approaching is different in this specific and fundamental way. It is a transformation that affects not only the world that human beings inhabit, but the nature of the beings who inhabit it. The fundamental cognitive parameters, the fundamental biological parameters, the fundamental relationship between the individual inner life and the external systems that have, for the entirety of human history, been unable to penetrate it with the depth and the precision and the influence that the converging developments are making possible. The transformation is not to the conditions within which human beings of a constant nature live. It is to the nature itself. And the genuine uncertainty about what comes after a transformation to the nature of the beings who do the imagining is precisely the uncertainty that no imaginative projection from within the current nature can fully resolve. What Harari does say, with considerable precision and considerable urgency, is what the transformation requires of the human beings who are alive in the window before it. Not as a preparation for a specific future that can be described in advance,